Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of Tenant Tuesdays at 2, a weekly program put on by the Housing Unit at Community Legal Services to educate tenants on updates related to COVID-19 and also just to provide as much information as we have as we help people with this time of crisis. Today, I am joined by David Wengert, who is a social worker within the Housing Unit here at CLS, and he's also the chair of the action team on illegal lockouts for the mayor. So we have a lot of expertise to share with you today on the topic of illegal evictions. That's kind of where we're going to put our focus on this session. As most people know, courts are still closed at this point in time, so we want to give people information that's actionable during this time period. As a point of beginning, I just want to address last week's session. As you may have known if you were here last week, we were unfortunately hacked during our presentation. So this presentation is being pre-recorded. We do intend to return in a live format in the coming weeks, but we just wanted to kind of take some time to take all of the security measures necessary to make sure that both our presenters and our audience members are safe. So you can look out both on the CLS Facebook page and phillytenant.org for any updates and maybe pre-registration links if we decide to go that route for people to be able to join us. But when we do return live, you'll at least be able to watch us through Facebook Live. But I kind of wanted to address the issue at the outset. We're working on it to make it a better environment for everyone. And we thank you for sticking through it with us as we navigate what COVID-19 from home really looks like as we advocate on the part of our clients. So David, I'm going to start the conversation off with the legal eviction process requires the landlord to make a filing in municipal court, take their tenant to court, and then there is some time period at a minimum of 21 days that a client has to wait before a sheriff or landlord tenant officer can show up to their home and have them removed from their home if that's the end result of the eviction process. Can you explain to us what an illegal eviction is?
Sure, thank you, Kadeem. You're exactly right. You know, the regular process for a landlord is to send notice. There's a hearing in court after the landlord files, and then if there's a judgment against the tenant, that can result in their eviction by either the sheriff or a landlord-tenant officer. However, there are times when landlords, for whatever reason, perhaps they're impatient or not aware of the legal process, decide that they're going to take an eviction into their own hands. And so they'll try things like changing locks, removing windows or doors. Sometimes they'll turn off utility service, water or electric or gas. Other times they simply make a lot of threats and they harass a tenant until the tenant feels that they can't stay in the property safely any longer.
So it's safe to say that an illegal lockout or eviction is any process outside of the court process that a landlord might use to coerce, intimidate, or encourage a tenant to move out of the property without having going through court or being locked out pursuant to a sheriff or a landlord-tenant officer. Does that give the right context of what we're talking about?
That's correct. If you are a tenant in the city of Philadelphia, you have the right to what's known as due process. So you have a right to go to court to defend yourself if a landlord's trying to evict you. Landlords who take it upon themselves to try to force a tenant out through threats or through actual changing locks are not giving the tenant the opportunity to defend themselves, and that's why it's illegal.
Okay. And I know you spoke about in the examples that you were given, I think they can be categorized in two ways. There's blocking access to the property and then also making the property uninhabitable. So I guess we can start with blocking access to the property. What are some of the ways that a landlord might typically try to block access to a property?
Right. So access is certainly part of an eviction. Just being able to get in through the front door. So what some landlords will do is they'll either change locks or remove locks, or they'll somehow board up a property and make it so that the tenant you physically can't get into the property.
Okay, and then making the property uninhabitable. I think that sounds a little more nuanced for most of our listeners. What would that be? Because in my mind, I'm thinking maybe they turn off power. What else can they do in the habitability standpoint?
Right. So some tenants, they're dealing with a landlord who either neglects the property to the point where they can no longer live there, or goes and intentionally tries to make the property not habitable or not able to be lived in. So you'll have some situations where a landlord will remove windows or doors. You'll have another situation where they'll shut off the utilities. Some situations involve a landlord simply not providing heat in order to try to force the tenant out of their property without actually having to go to court.
So I know generally when everything's up and running and we're not in the middle of a pandemic, the usual recourse might be contact the Fair Housing Commission and file a complaint against your landlord and stay in your property while that works out. But during this time when things are especially sensitive, there's a stay-at-home order in place. People are out of work, so their options are a little more limited and their resources to fight back can be somehow hampered. What should tenants really do during this time period?
Right. So actually, normally, under normal circumstances, the tenant's first and most effective way to address an illegal eviction is to call 911. The police have a directive about how they're supposed to handle these types of calls. And the directive, it's 3.17, it tells the police exactly what they're supposed to do. So the first step when the police come out to the property is they're supposed to identify who's involved. Are these tenants? Who's the landlord? Figure out who the people are in the situation. The police then are supposed to check to see if this is a legal eviction. They can, right now, as you pointed out, because the courts aren't open, there are no legal evictions. So any eviction that's happening at this point in time are illegal. And so that part's easy for the police at this point to verify that an eviction is illegal. After the police have determined who's there and whether the eviction is legal or not, the police then will notify the tenant that they have a right to get back in, and they notify the landlord that they need to either give the tenant keys, put the locks back on, turn on the utility, or whatever the landlord has done, they need to undo it. The last part about the police response is that they're supposed to do two things. They write up an incident report, and then they are supposed to write up a summary citation against the landlord. What we do have most officers doing is writing up the incident report. It's less common that the officer would write up a summary citation against the landlord.
Have there been any changes in the way the police are handling these cases in COVID-19? I know that there was an overall change to police protocol around the city in terms of how they interact with individuals and how many people they're taken into custody and doing various things. Have there been any changes that directly affect illegal lockouts?
Yes. We're being told by the police department that they moved to what they're calling differential police response. So normally, under normal circumstances, a tenant in this type of situation would call 911 and a police officer would respond to their address. What you're seeing right now, mostly due to COVID-19 and trying to protect officers from being exposed, is that calls where the crime is not in progress are actually just being routed to the district. And the district is then taking police reports over the phone. So if the crime is in progress, if a tenant calls and says, my landlord's here, they're changing the locks, the police will still respond as they normally would. However, because of the pandemic and the shutdown related to the pandemic, right now, if the illegal eviction's already taken place and the landlord's no longer on site, the police are primarily going to simply take a police report over the phone, and then they may be able to offer some advocacy on the part of the tenant by calling the landlord and explaining what the law is to the landlord and telling the landlord what they need to do.
Okay, that's good information to know. Now, I know we've been talking about police involvement with the landlord and with the housing situation in terms of an illegal lockout, but are there any consequences for, let's say, our clients if they call the police and police involvement comes to their home? Because I know our clients are in several different situations. Some may be more comfortable than some with police interaction. So is there anything that they should be aware of at the outset?
Yes. So obviously, different people have different levels of comfort with interacting with the police. Unfortunately, right now, there's no other entity that can really help with an illegal eviction as much as the police can. So what we are recommending that people do is when an officer does come out, if the individual is not getting the response that they expected, or the officer's not following the protocol, we recommend that they then call 911 again and ask for a supervisor to come out. That gives the opportunity for a lieutenant or a captain within the district who may be more familiar with the protocols to respond to the situation. The other option for tenants who are having issues with working with the police to try to resolve this type of situation is they can make a complaint with the Police Advisory Commission. So the Police Advisory Commission, they have through their website the ability to file a complaint against an officer or bring to the attention of the commission an issue with how an officer responded. And they're pretty quick to follow up on those complaints and to try to address the underlying issue. A second thing that a tenant could do if they're having issues either with the police or with the landlord on site is to call the Philly Tenant Hotline. So tenants throughout Philadelphia can get a lot of legal advice information from the Philly Tenant Hotline by calling 267-443-2500, 267-443-2500. And it's a great way to talk to an advocate and to perhaps get more assistance with the situation as it's unfolding. Tenants can also go to phillytenant.org, which is www.phillytenant.org, which is a website with a lot of up-to-date information regarding COVID-19 shutdown, as well as illegal evictions that may be happening during this time. And Kadeem, before you jump in, there's actually a fourth thing that we just learned about, which is that the Attorney General's office is interested in illegal evictions. They want to make sure at the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office that people like landlords are following the stay-at-home order and are waiting for the courts to reopen before they proceed with evictions. So there is a way to file complaints also through the Attorney General's office. And all of those links to the Police Advisory Commission, to the Philly Tenant Hotline, and to the Attorney General's office are all available through our legal eviction flyer, which is at phillytenant.org.
That's great information, I think, for our tenants and clients to have. So I think we spoke a lot about what the immediate police response should be and how to go about if you think that the response or interaction that you have didn't yield a result that you wanted. What is the general advice for tenants who maybe they're an essential worker, they went out to do their job, they came home, their locks have changed, their house is boarded up, the power's off, and they know that they've paid the water bill or the power bill, the utility company is not doing any shutoffs during this time period. What are people to do when it's not an immediate, my landlord is actively locking me out, but my landlord has taken action that has either denied me access to the property or made my property uninhabitable, and they're not there at the moment. I know you spoke about the hotline, but is there like a process that maybe we can walk them through that police interaction process and what to do with the report that I assume would get generated from that interaction?
Yeah, so the most important thing to be is for the tenant to be ready to go to show the police proof that they're a tenant. And that can be difficult. If you've been illegally locked out, you weren't necessarily expecting this, and it may be hard to prove tenancy. And what we often look for when we're encouraging tenants to be able to gather the information to be able to prove it is any type of rent receipts, maybe an ID with the address that they've been evicted from, any type of mail, official mail for that address. Even if you don't, I mean, it'd be great if you had your lease agreement, right, on your person, but that's kind of unlikely for a lot of people. So sometimes, folks will just have text messages with the landlord, indicating that that's where they reside. And that can be sufficient for a police officer to determine, yes, you are a tenant in this property, you do have a right to be here. The other thing that we recommend, go ahead.
So text messages, Cash App receipts, any sort of history that you have with the landlord that can actually like pinpoint this location as your residence, something that tenants should have when they are going to make this initial interaction with the police.
That's right. And that's the information that the police are going to ask for, and that's also the information that advocates are going to ask for. So if I'm working with someone who's been illegally evicted, the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that they're a tenant in the property, and I also want to make sure that an illegal eviction has actually taken place or has been threatened. Once we figured that part out, though, a big part of what advocates do is they'll start by calling the landlord and asking the landlord to comply with the law and to go through the regular court process. If landlords won't do it and the person's not getting any success with the police, sometimes we'll contact the police and send them some information. We've been really successful for some cases where the illegal eviction hasn't happened yet, but we've been able to contact the police and give them a heads up so that they know that if an illegal eviction does happen at this address, they're ready for it, they know to expect it, and they know to respond.
Sounds great. So I'm looking through the process in my mind. You've got a tenant who's been locked out. They've either contacted the police and hopefully been restored to the property if that's an option. If immediate restoration is not an option, what kind of court options exist for people who have been illegally locked out to compel their landlord to get them back into the property? Is there an emergency filing process or some way or avenue to push that along?
There is. So there's sort of two things that tenants generally want after an illegal eviction. Some of them want to get back into the property. They live there, their things are there, and they need to be there because they have nowhere else to go. So for those tenants, they might find some place to stay temporarily, but they're going to need some sort of court order to get back into the property that they were renting. So there is what's called an injunction process through the city of Philadelphia. In the last few weeks, community legal services advocates have filed some injunctions to try to make sure that tenants who have been illegally evicted or had their utilities illegally shut off can get back into their properties and get the utilities on. Now, some tenants have been able to go through that process on their own. It's definitely a tricky process. It's not something that's simple. So we would always recommend calling the Philly Tenant Hotline and getting an advocate to help you with that process. But ultimately, through a court order, some tenants are able to force the landlord to get those utilities back on or get what they need, get access to the property. Now, in addition to, for the tenants who don't necessarily want to go back to the property, they just want their landlord to pay some sort of price or consequence for their actions. There are a number of tenants who say, my landlord threw out all my stuff. I don't have any of that anymore. And I really need to be compensated for all of the things that I've lost. Not to mention, suddenly losing your housing out of nowhere is incredibly traumatizing. So what we recommend for those clients is they can try to file a lawsuit against their landlord. Once the courts reopen, they will be able to file either a small claims case against their landlord or a case in the Court of Common Pleas. Either way, a small claims case or a case through the Court of Common Pleas, tenants can do themselves, or sometimes there are advocates who can help with that.
Okay, so I'm kind of thinking about this. You mentioned find a place to stay in that interim. Are there resources that are available and or mobilized right now for tenants who have been the victim of an illegal lockout? They can't regain access to their property. They don't necessarily have someone that they can stay with for more than maybe 1 or 2 nights on their couch. I know the shelter system right now has a lot of constraints as we try to get people off the street in COVID-19. So what's the best place to point those tenants to get housed maybe temporarily? And is that an expense that they should try to pay out of pocket and then, as you said, file a suit against their landlord? Are there any existing entities that are specifically helping tenants in this position?
Right, so there are definitely limited options. So a tenant who's been illegally evicted can certainly go to try to find someone to stay with who they know, a friend or a family. They can try to go into the shelter system, which a number of tenants do. They can also try to use some savings, and we have a number of families who try to stay temporarily in motels or hotels. And we certainly recommend that they keep all their receipts because they may be able to sue the landlord down the road for the cost of that hotel or motel. But luckily the shelter system is still functioning at this time, and the family can seek shelter through that system. If a family has questions about finding shelter through that system, they can certainly call, as I've been saying, the Philly Tenant Hotline, or there is a homeless hotline, and I can grab that number. I don't actually have it offhand right now.
Okay, so I think it's been a lot of helpful information. I kind of just want to recap and make sure, like, in small doses, that we have everything that our clients would need. So an illegal lockout is a lockout that is happening now, that the courts are, and legal lockouts aren't happening. And also any lockout or attempt to make your property uninhabitable that is done outside of the court process. So anything that doesn't involve court right now is a legal lockout. And even if you've been to court theoretically and you're locked out right now without the assistance of a sheriff or a landlord tenant officer, that's theoretically also an illegal lockout. And then to follow up on that, the most immediate thing for our clients, tenants, or just people trying to get this information out there to do is to call the police with proof of tenancy, as whatever information it is that you have, whether it's a rent receipt, a ID with that address on it, have some proof that this is where I live and this is where I belong, this is home for me. And alongside that, if it's actively happening, then you should also call the police and say, my landlord is at my home right now, actively trying to remove me from this property. I've got a lease, I've paid rent, there's no court filing, no court date. I need some sort of protection from this process. And that's where theoretically the police response should be, someone would be dispatched to your home for that active incident to mediate between you and your landlord and advise your landlord to go through the normal court process when the court reopens. Do I have that correct so far?
That all sounds correct.
All right, and then in terms of resources, phillytenant.org is a website that is there with tenant resources, both around illegal evictions and other issues. And of course, our hotline, 267-443-2500, is where you can get in touch with an advocate from Community Legal Services or other organizations that staff that hotline to kind of help you advocate for yourself. And they can both get involved with advocacy with your landlord and with the police department if that's a step that needs to be taken at that point to kind of push you through that process. And there's also the possibility of having injunctive relief through a filing in court to say, this is your property, you belong there, you haven't been locked out pursuant to that court process. So is there anything that you want to reinforce for tenants, people on the call, just generally things they should know about this process?
No, I think that was a great summary. I mean, you have the police involvement as it's happening. You can get an advocate involved if you need an advocate, and you might eventually, as an emergency or down the road, go to court over the issue. Right now, you know, the most important thing is the first thing you said, which is there are no legal evictions happening because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's so important that landlords be patient and understand that they can't go through an eviction right now. And for tenants to understand that they have rights if a landlord's trying to force them out. And we encourage them to reach out and get an advocate on their side if they're facing that problem.
So as we wrap up, David, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit with us today and have this discussion about illegal lockouts, because I think a lot of people are familiar with what the legal court process is, but not as many people are familiar with there's this illegal process that's happening and there is some level of recourse for our tenants and clients during this time period to kind of self-advocate and also get help and assistance from us and the police. So I appreciate all of the information that you have shared. This has been the second edition of Tenant Tuesdays at 2 with myself, Kadeem Morris, and David Wenger from Community Legal Services focusing on illegal lockouts. We hope you find this information helpful. You can always find resources at phillytenant.org. That is www.phillytenant.org. And you can also call our hotline at 267-443-2500, and a staff person will respond to you in about 24 to 48 hours to give you some information and resources. We hope to be back next week with a live format that you can log in and ask questions as we go through. But we thank you for joining us today. We hope this information is helpful, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks all.